Just making sure you can all hear me as well.
Yes, we can. Thanks, Karen.
Okay, good.
Good morning, Commissioner Lanier. All right, who am I missing? Just Commissioner Ruppert?
Good morning.
Good morning. Oh, there he is. Good morning, Commissioner.
Good morning.
All right.
Hey, Sassy, what's for breakfast?
First snack, Commissioner. So it's going to be a long day, so you got to fuel up in between.
That's right. It is going to be a long day. So, and it's already been a long morning. I know all of you have already been in standing meetings. So,
and some of us didn't go on spring break.
All right, commissioners, we'll go ahead and get started then, and we'll call our committee of the whole meeting to order. So just a couple things. We have a number of action items. We have two presentations today, one on shared micromobility and one on the housing fund. And then we do have an executive session related to a legal opinion right after COW. So I'll call for that question at the end. And then tonight for our evening meeting, we do have a pretty long agenda. We have 6 scheduled public hearings. What I'd like to do is take the first 2 together. They're related to the same project. So we'll have 5 scheduled public hearings in addition to our other 2 opportunities for public comment. So likely a lengthy meeting tonight as well. So with that, we'll get started on the first item. And this is a resolution scheduling special meetings of the City Commission in May. And these are related to our budget discussions and budget deliberations. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Support.
All right, moved and supported. Commissioners, any questions or comments? All of you should have already received Outlook invites for these days and times. All right, seeing no questions or comments, I'll turn to our city clerk to call for the vote.
Commissioner Ruppert?
Yes.
Commissioner Lanier?
Aye.
Commissioner Jones?
Yes.
Commissioner O'Connor?
Yes.
Commissioner Moody?
Yes.
Commissioner Asasi?
Yes.
Mayor Bliss?
Yes, it carries. Next item is a resolution recommending approval by the Michigan Liquor Control Commission of a social district permit application pursuant to Public Act 124 of 2020. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Support.
Support.
All right, moved and supported. We have Mr. Canfield here to tell us about this item.
All right. Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. This is a familiar item in a format you've seen previously. It is to recommend approval by the Michigan Liquor Control Commission of a social district permit so that a local business can participate in the social districts that you've set up. As a reminder, those allow to-go service in special labeled cups. And this particular request is from HIH Incorporated at 710 Monroe, which is Embassy Suites, inclusive of Big E's Sports Grill.
Great. Thank you, Lou. Commissioners, any questions or comments? All right. Seeing none, I'll go ahead and ask our city clerk to call for the vote.
Commissioner Lanier?
Aye.
Commissioner Jones?
Yes.
Commissioner O'Connor?
Yes.
Commissioner Moody?
Yes.
Commissioner Asasi?
Yes.
Commissioner Ruppert?
Yes.
Mayor Bliss?
Yes, it carries. Thank you. All right, next item before us, this is a resolution adopting the city's legislative priority agenda for the 2021-2022 legislative term. Similar to last year, this is a new process that we started. So the legislative team over the last several months have been working with our government affairs specialists and our consultants to identify what our priorities will be, recognizing that they may change a little bit. But overall, these will be our focus areas for the year ahead. So can I get a motion?
So moved.
Support.
All right, moved and supported. And we have Ms. Farrick here to walk us through and just touch on a few of the highlights and then answer any questions that you may have.
Thanks, everyone. Good morning.
The resolution before you today advances the legislative priority agenda for the 2021-2022 legislative term, and this includes both state and federal priorities. And as the mayor stated, the purpose is really to clearly outline the position and interests of the city. It is aligned with commission priorities and the strategic plan and maintains many of the legislative priorities from the previous term that we have been continuing to advocate for. The COVID pandemic has really necessitated a little shift and inclusion of some new legislative priorities, which I'll touch on. So I wanted to go over the top 4 legislative priorities for the city and names those as follows. Fiscal relief, sustainability, and economic recovery investment, including income tax policy reform, tax policy that will enhance local revenue options, reforms to revenue sharing and municipal finance, permanent extension of social district enabling legislation, and then restoring Headley's original allowance for upward and downward fluctuations in millage rates based on actual inflationary activity to allow the Proposal A in Headley to work as intended. We will also include, and this was an existing top priority, local options and tools to support increased housing to ensure that all residents have safe, stable, and permanent housing. And then we've added public safety policy and investments that advance safer communities, transparency, and positive community relationships and trust, with an emphasis on responsible criminal justice reform and investment in safe neighborhoods and police relationships. And then finally, the 4th priority remains River Restoration and Revitalization Project. As we did previously with our agenda, the resolution also details the principles to be used by the city manager, myself, and the legislative committee in initiating, evaluating, and responding to legislative initiatives that impact the city and its residents. And as part of that list, we maintained many of the principles that we've continued to use, but we have added a few. And so I just want to touch briefly on those. We have added acknowledging racism as a public health crisis and supporting policies and opportunities to dismantle structural racism and achieve health and social equity. We've also added, I would say, a more robust item dealing with our environment and conservation of natural resources. And so it stated that one of our principles would be responsibly protecting our environment and conserving our natural resources through policies and investments that increase climate resiliency, reduce carbon emissions, and support renewable energy production at industrial, community, and residential scale. And then finally, we've added promoting policy and investments that increase accessibility of affordable broadband service for residents, as well as robust broadband infrastructure that supports business growth, attraction, and retention. So those are some of the highlights and tweaks, I will say, and many of the other items remain on our priority agenda. So I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Farrick. All right, questions or comments? I know Commissioner Jones and Commissioner O'Connor serve on the legislative team, so they've had an opportunity to weigh in on this and be a part of the conversation. Commissioners, anything to add from your perspective? Commissioner O'Connor?
No, I'm really excited again to have this document. I think this is just important for us to have our priorities laid out so that we can clearly communicate with policymakers in Lansing about what, as the second largest city in the state, I think we need to be able to, leverage our influence down there to help advance policy that helps people in Grand Rapids. And so I think having this clear, it's a broad document, but it has some definite clear priorities about what's important to us and what values we hold dear. I think that's important as we try to advance, advance good public policy that helps residents here in Grand Rapids.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. Commissioner Jones?
Yeah, just wanted to say hats off to Karen and her work, as well as that of the folks that we work with, both in Lansing and DC, with our lobbyists. I think it's a well thought out and a very strategic approach that we're taking, and especially in light of the fact that so much is happening in terms of legislation, in terms of funding opportunity, and as much as we, I think, like to be the recipient of as much as we could possibly get our hands on, the reality is there just seems to be a whole lot of moving parts right now. And I think that we're taking a very strategic approach and are positioning ourselves to really be the recipient of some solid funding, but also some real opportunity to bring about change that will hopefully, again, provide great opportunities for us here in Grand Rapids and West Michigan. I continuously, I keep shaking my head regarding what seems to be the funding inequities, with the dollars that are coming from DC specifically in response to the pandemic from the Biden administration. And when you compare what a city like Grand Rapids is getting compared to the 313 in Detroit, I know there's a formula, but I still, again, I'm scratching my head in terms of how certain cities are getting certain dollars, and yet I'm trusting the process, and I'm hopeful that, again, that we can continue on the path of trying to be very strategic and tapping into some dollars. So.
Thanks, Commissioner. All right, Commissioner Lanier, and then Commissioner Isasi.
Thanks, Mayor. Thanks, Karen, for the summary, and thanks, Commissioners O'Connor and Jones, for your serving on the committee. I think this is a really good document that, to the point that Commissioner Jones was making, that's broad, but it also has some very specific targeted goals and priorities that we'd like to target, and I'm happy to see that, and many of them are things we've been talking about for a long time. What I'd like to do, though, is, I think we talked about this the last time we had our legislative priorities. I think it would be great to have a postponement of the adoption so that the rest of the commission can have some time to absorb kind of the complexities that exist within the document. Because what came to mind for me as I was reviewing it is many of the conversations we have when either there are citizen groups or even in some departments, some responses are, we can't do that because of the law prevents us from being able to do that, et cetera. And I want to make sure that I have enough time to have multiple conversations in order to be able to weigh in fully. And since this is our first public discussion, if you all are willing, I'd like for us to postpone the adoption until our next meeting.
So, Commissioner, are you making a motion to just table it till our next meeting?
Sure, and it would be postponed instead of table, because table would mean the same meeting. The decision will be made in that same meeting. So it's technical, but postponing is the appropriate language.
Okay, so postpone till our next meeting.
Yes, that's my motion, yes.
Right, but I want to be clear, you want to postpone it and have it on our agenda at our Committee of the Whole on our April 27th meeting? Yes?
Yes, please. Mm-hmm.
So is there a support for that motion to postpone till April 27th to give the commissioners who haven't had a chance to be on the legislative team to have more time to review this and to provide some input? Oh,
this is Commissioner. Sorry, I was on my mute button. I would support that, and then I have a comment to why I would support.
okay. All right. So we have a motion to postpone till our next meeting and supported. Commissioners, anyone else want to weigh in on this, or maybe Ms. Farrick? I think we have time to spend a little bit more time on this. So taking 2 more weeks, I don't think is necessarily a detriment. Ms. Farrick, any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, certainly it's up to you all how you want to vote for that postponement, but I'm open to that. That's fine with me.
Okay. All right. Commissioners, any other thoughts or questions? Commissioner Isasi?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to add, so my comment was really around, I'm supportive of what's in the document. I think and thank you for the work that you all did. My concern is something that I feel like was missing from the priorities, which I think that the city has really worked on over the last year, and I feel like even in the past, but we spent so much time on the census, so much time on making sure voting rights were protected. And you know, all the work that the city clerk and a variety of city staff did to make sure that people were able to file their ballots. And I could see it fitting into the broad topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I think we have some things that are happening, to what Commissioner O'Connor said, kind of at the state level around voting access and voting rights. And so I did want some time to be able to talk about that with some of you. And did not have that chance prior, you know, just obviously the timing and spring break and things like that. So that's one of the reasons that I would like to postpone, and I would be supportive of it. And I also would like to say that publicly that I'm supportive of what's in the document existing as is. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. You know, that's an excellent point. We started working on this a couple months ago before some of the bills were passed in Georgia, and before we saw this uptick to try to suppress people's right to vote. And I think that's a very good point. And I know many of us have talked about and actually been contacted by folks about, you know, what we can do to support voter protections, but voter rights as well. And so that would be something that we could consider adding. Yeah, good, excellent point. Commissioners, any additional comments or thoughts, City Manager?
So Mayor, that's helpful. And so helpful feedback, and we'll have the staff work with our lobbyists and trying to begin to incorporate some of the suggested changes. But if there are any other suggestions, please let me know. That way we can have a good draft to bring forward that reflects some of the feedback that we have both on the dais and off the dais. And lastly, I do want to echo my appreciation to Ms. Farrick and also our lobbyists, Mr. Carey and Mr. Jackson, not just for helping this document, but getting us results out of both Lansing and out of DC over the past year. We've had to pay more attention to our legislative issues as we can't recover by ourselves now more than ever. And they have really, really worked hard to represent the interests of all of Grand Rapids. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, City Manager. So I have two thoughts. One, I know those of us who meet monthly for legislative team, we hear those regular updates and we're able to track it, but it would be nice to have kind of a summary of this past year successes and the projects that we worked on and what the issues that we advocated for, maybe a summary of that shared with the entire commission. And then secondly, commissioners, I'll ask those of you who have additional feedback or would like to see something added or amended, if you could provide that feedback to Ms. Farrick and the city manager over the next week so that we can have a draft to review a good week in advance before our next meeting. I think that would be helpful. So if we can kind of make that a priority over the next couple of weeks, that would be appreciated. Does that sound good? Okay, so let's call the vote then on the postponement to our April 27th meeting.
Commissioner Jones,
Yes.
Commissioner O'Connor,
Yes.
Commissioner Moody,
Yes.
Commissioner Sassi,
Yes.
Commissioner Ruppert,
Yes.
Commissioner Lanier,
Aye.
Mayor Bliss.
Yes, it carries. All right, Commissioner, so we'll revisit this in 2 weeks, and in the meantime, we'll have some additional conversations. All right. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. All right, next that will take us to our fourth item. This is a resolution scheduling a public hearing on May 11th for the necessity of a one-year special assessment for enhanced services in the Downtown Improvement District. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Support.
All right, moved and supported. We have the CEO of DGRI and the DDA, Mr. Tim Kelly, with us. So I'll turn it over to him to provide some information on this. Go ahead, Tim.
Great. Thanks, Mayor. Good morning, everyone. Happy to be with you again this morning. As the Mayor mentioned, this item is a request to approve the resolution establishing May 11, 2021 as the date for a public hearing of necessity to continue the Downtown Improvement District for fiscal year 22. Reminder, the DID is an assessment on real property that was established back in 2000 to provide enhanced maintenance and beautification services in downtown beyond what is provided by the city. Our current one-year authorization expires June 30, 2021, and so we're requesting a public hearing and ultimately your approval to continue the DID and the important services it pay for. Quick reminder on what those are. So the DID currently pays for daily sidewalk cleaning, including some snow removal at intersections and around parking meters, flower planting and beautification, snow melt operation and maintenance, marketing, as well as the ambassador and clean team services. I did want to take a quick moment just to underline the important work that the ambassador team did over the past year. They've really been critical in helping us to respond to the evolving needs brought on by the pandemic. As an example, early on in the pandemic, they stepped up on sanitizing of infrastructure. They've been incredibly useful and instrumental in the social zone rollout and deployment, including the ongoing maintenance and management of those public spaces. They helped with setup, takedown of the World of Winter activities. I've also been liaison and coordinated with the city's hot team over the past year. And that's all in addition to their daily work. Over 65% of the DID assessment, the district-wide assessment that is, goes toward the ambassador and clean team service. And so in light of that and all the other important work that the DID provides, both our reauthorization steering committee as well as our DID board unanimously recommended that the DID be extended for one additional year so that they continue their important work. Included in your packet was a cover memo, the report, as well as the proposed fiscal year 22 budget. Like last year, no other changes are being introduced for the upcoming year. That goes for both the rate, the boundary, as well as the services provided. The one change being recommended does involve the existing snowmelt districts. So currently, there are 3 separate districts for Monument Park, Monroe Center, and the Camp Out Promenade. Beginning in fiscal year 22, the recommendation is to combine those into one district. Administratively, that'll create some efficiencies and it'll help us reduce the overall budget from $225,000 currently down to $180,000. Also, those districts are geographically adjacent, and so there is a shared benefit among districts that front the snow melt. No other changes are proposed in this plan. And so with your approval today, we would establish a public hearing for May 11. Notices would be mailed out to all the impacted property owners in accordance with state and local policy. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Would also point out that my colleague and DJRI's operations manager, Melvin Elledge, is on the call.
Great, thank you. Commissioners, any questions for either Melvin or Tim? Commissioner Lanier?
Thanks, Tim, for that detailed summary. And I just wanted to shout out Melvin. I've never seen him out of uniform and in a suit. So good to see you this morning, Melvin.
Thanks, Commissioner.
Good to see you too.
Commissioners, any other questions or comments? All right, well, I'm just going to add one comment and say thanks to both Tim, but also thanks to Melvin for leading a really great team. And we're so fortunate to have the ambassadors in our city. And, I see them out doing important work throughout our community every day and developing relationships with people throughout our city. So I really appreciate their hard work and their work this past year, especially during the pandemic. So many of you know their priority shifted to cleaning and sanitizing and doing everything they could to make sure that our spaces were safe for individuals. So I just want to say thank you. So, all right, with that, then I think we'll call for the vote. Again, this would set the public hearing for May 11th. City Clerk?
Commissioner O'Connor,
Yes.
Commissioner Moody, Commissioner Moody, sorry, I didn't hear you.
Yes.
Commissioner Asasi,
Yes.
Commissioner Repart,
Yes.
Commissioner Lanier,
Aye.
Commissioner Jones,
Yes.
Mayor Bliss.
Yes, it carries. All right, Commissioners, that will take us to our last action item before us today, and this is a resolution authorizing certain special events subject to Chapter 53 of the City Code. Can I get a motion?
Support.
All right, moved and supported. We have Ms. Pittman here with us today, so I'll turn it over to her to share with us some information, and then I'll open it up for questions or comments.
Good morning, Mayor and City Commissioners. Thank you so much for looking at this resolution, as we know, 2020 was definitely a difficult year for events. Events and activities were severely limited, and that lack of activity actually added to the economic recession and caused a social and emotional disconnect in our community as vaccinations are increasing and COVID cases hopefully start to decrease. Our event organizers are hopeful to resume events and activities and follow our state and federal orders. The resolution identifies special events that will occur hopefully in April through December of 2021. Those events all have to have insurance, as well as submit an emergency action plan that details the event organizers' plans to mitigate measures as required. That EAP is reviewed by both my office and the Grand Rapids Fire Department with guidance from the Kent County Health Department.
Thank you. All right, commissioners, any questions or comments? All right, seeing none, I'll turn to our city clerk.
Commissioner Moody.
Yes.
Commissioner Isasi.
Yes.
Commissioner Repart.
Yes.
Commissioner Lanier.
Aye.
Commissioner Jones.
Yes.
Commissioner O'Connor.
Yes.
Mayor Bliss.
Yes, it carries. All right, thank you, everyone. Next, that will take us to our two briefings and updates today. We have two of them before us, one on shared micromobility, and then we have an update on the Grand Rapids Housing Fund. So I think I'll turn it over to our city manager to tee both of these up. And I will put myself on mute during these presentations. We'll go ahead and get through the presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions or comments afterwards. City manager?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. And kind of tied into some of the comments from Ms. Pittman about some of the upcoming events and activation. One of the things that we have seen that has also caused increased activation during COVID has been the use of some of our micro-mobility projects, and specifically the scooters. And so we are very pleased to give you an update. No action needed today. We've gotten a lot of good feedback, and we want to thank Josh Naramore and Justin Kimura for their leadership. And we're going to ask Mr. Kimura to walk us through the briefing.
All right, thank you, City Manager. Let me go ahead and bring my screen up here. All right, City Manager.
I will say one other thing before he starts. A lot of people said it couldn't be done. And when we were kicking this off, it was not in the middle of the summer, and it was towards the fall. And we said we were going to be a year-round city to include activation in the winter. And this is one of the challenges we took upon this year during COVID. So I'm sorry, Justin, go right ahead.
A four-season city, city manager.
All right, good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. Can everybody hear me and see my screen okay? So thank you for the opportunity to present a 6-month update on the city's shared micromobility pilot. I've got a lot of good information to share this morning, so let's get right to it. All right, so the city's strategic plan highlighted the need for mobile GR to pursue innovative and modern mobility options, such as bike share programs. As such, in 2017 through 18, we partnered with local stakeholders to conduct a bike share feasibility study. Bike share systems provide point-to-point, on-demand transportation that connects people to local destinations and other modes of transportation. It is ideal for short trips like running errands, and a key part of our transit network by providing first mile and last mile connections to larger transit options. Additionally, bike share systems provide people with an affordable outdoor recreation activity and can also contribute to an overall increase in bicycling activity by reducing the barrier of entry to bicycling. As the feasibility study identified several goals of a bike share system, we embarked on this pilot to better understand the viability of such a program, identify pros and cons of different systems, and determine parameters and policies necessary to sustain a long-term shared system in Grand Rapids. As most of you are aware, we launched our shared micromobility service on September 30th, 2020 with a company called Spin. We started that day with about 200 electric stand-up scooters spread out over a 12 square mile pilot area. This initial area was based on the analysis of the 2018 feasibility study and incorporated in our bicycle action plan. The pilot area covers almost 1/3 of the city, includes about 95,000 residents from our population, and includes about 75% of our underserved neighborhoods. In an effort to keep the system more organized as well as make it easier for users to find scooters, we established 176 designated parking zones. These parking zones are primarily located in the curb area of the public right-of-way, as well as in marked-off stalls in city-owned parking lots. In other cities, the parking guidance is looser, only directing users to park near the edge of the sidewalk or near bike racks and away from access ramps, transit stops, and building entrances. In addition to Spin, we were also scheduled to partner with a second vendor who would provide additional vehicle options to include e-assist bicycles. Due to COVID impacts, that vendor suspended all new starts last fall and was eventually acquired by another mobility company. As such, we restarted our vendor selection process in December, and as of last week have selected Lime as our second vendor. I anticipate seeking City Commission approval for an operating agreement with Lime in the coming weeks and hope to have their electric stand-up scooters and e-assist bicycles deployed soon thereafter. So in contrast to the bike share feasibility study, which initially recommended a publicly owned system operated by a nonprofit entity, we chose to pursue a city-managed partnership with a private company. The original recommendation would have required approximately $300,000 in startup overhead costs, plus $3,800 per bike. From there, annual maintenance and operations would have cost an estimated $2,400 per bike. And by year 5 of the program, revenue estimates would still only cover about 80% of the costs. These costs were also estimated just for regular bicycles, not for the electric scooters and e-assist bicycles on the market today. In the few years that have passed since the original feasibility study, the shared micromobility industry and the private companies within has experienced rapid change and growth. Our course adjustment based on these changes has proven to be the right choice. I will get into more budget details in a forthcoming slide, but in short, I can tell you that the city has spent no funds on the general operation of the micromobility system, and instead has been able to focus our funding on infrastructure investments and programs to promote equity. As I previously stated, the purpose of this shared micromobility pilot was to implement an innovative, efficient, and equitable mobility option for point-to-point on-demand transportation that could connect people to local destinations and other modes of transit, consistent with the goals and objectives of the city's strategic plan and the bicycle action plan. To ensure our pilot can achieve this purpose and facilitate an informed decision for a post-pilot long-term service, we developed this evaluation criteria to evaluate our multiple vendors, as well as evaluate the city's supporting role. So we're collecting feedback through both quantitative and qualitative means. On the quantitative side, Spin provides the city with monthly data reports that document ridership numbers, characteristics of ride, common locations, among others. Not only does this data provide us with historical documentation of the system's performance, it also provides the vendor with information on how to best tailor the system to users' needs. On the qualitative side, my team has shared project information and been open to feedback from community partners such as DGRI, the Neighborhood Association Consortium, and several of the corridor improvement authorities. We have an online survey tool where both users and non-users can provide feedback via an online form or through 311. To date, we have received input from about 550 people. While we are still receiving and analyzing these responses, in general, the majority of users are using the scooters for recreation and claim to park them correctly. About half admit to riding on sidewalks and do so because they are concerned about hitting by a passing car. These comments reinforce our need to continue expanding bicycle facilities in the city to provide safer riding corridors, as well as continue to promote micromobility as a viable transit option. We have received numerous comments ranging from praise for the new mobility system to scooter parking complaints via our mobile GR trouble ticket system. Spin is also able to collect feedback through their user app, and user ratings have averaged about 4.6 stars out of 5. Finally, we are also developing an online tool where citizens can provide feedback on existing parking zones or request changes and additions. This slide depicts our overall ridership data. As you can see, during the initial launch and through the fall, we had strong ridership as displayed by the blue line, often peaking at more than 1,000 riders per day. The orange line shows the daily amount of scooters on the street, which Spin adjusts based on ridership numbers, weather forecasts, day of the week, and other factors. You can see we had 3 system shutdowns for winter weather. Entering the pilot, our initial plan was to leave the scooters in place and just remotely shut them down. But we found that it was better to collect all of the scooters, have Spin take them back to their warehouse to better protect the equipment, and also facilitate better snow clearing operations. These shutdowns were primarily communicated through Spin's app, and we also provided 311 with the information to receive inquiries via phone. While ridership did drop a little during the winter, we were able to weather the storm, no pun intended, and ridership continues to rise as the weather warms up. So this slide here shows data on ride length and duration. Outside of a few significant outliers, riders typically use a scooter for about 25 minutes and travel about 2 miles per ride. In total, as of March 15th, the project has amassed 64,429 rides, which covered 127,250 miles over 26,299 hours. Of note, while we have received some anecdotal information about people falling off scooters or stumbling a bit, we have not received any reports of major accidents or interactions with pedestrians, bicycles, or other vehicles. So beyond the ridership data I just shared, this pilot program has also been successful in providing numerous other benefits. In general, shared micromobility systems are an eco-friendly transportation option. As I mentioned, the average duration of a ride has been about 25 minutes and 2 miles. Short trips such as these account for about 35% of all car trips in the United States. Shared micromobility can help people make these trips without relying on personal cars or taxis that cause congestion and contribute to climate change. As we get further into the pilot, I hope to get more granular data on the carbon footprint of our system. Shared micromobility systems also help us to promote, develop, and support multimodal corridors rather than ones that are catered for cars. This makes it safer for all non-car traffic, including other bicycles and pedestrians. Micromobility puts people on the street and gives them a positive view of the city, while also allowing riders to easily engage with local entities rather than driving right by them. Our system provides economic potential, as shared micromobility systems are a positive factor when attracting conferences and other large-scale events to the city. Finally, during this time of COVID, micromobility has proven to be a safe, socially distant outdoor recreation activity. So what are we learning? The most prevalent issues to date have been improper parking and sidewalk riding. These complaints are primarily received through 311 or emails to mobile GR. Recently, we have also received some complaints about riders doubling up on a scooter, as well as people under the age of 18 riding a scooter. To date, we have worked with Spin to respond with increased awareness and education efforts. However, as we progress further into the pilot and these concerns continue, I've asked Spin to consider incentivizing proper usage and potentially penalizing improper behavior. The Spin terms of agreement with its users does allow for fines for bad parking, improper usage, and other deviations from the agreement. But for various reasons, these penalties are typically reserved for the most egregious of violations. While we have received reports of blatantly bad behavior, such as scooters in the river or hanging from trees, I anecdotally believe that some of the parking outside of designated zones can be alleviated by us continuing to expand and adapt our parking zone locations. While most of the initial zones were installed with a temporary mindset due to this being a pilot, as we get further invested in the project, we are looking for more permanent installation options, such as including installing concrete pads in residential areas that are currently grass, or claiming some on-street parking spots. The final challenge has been ensuring that improperly parked scooters are picked up promptly and that scooters are appropriately distributed across the pilot area, dependent on riders' user habits. We continue to work with SPIN on refining these procedures. So after a long slide full of challenges, I'm happy to shift gears here a bit and discuss some of our equity initiatives with SPIN. The first is SPIN Community Pass. This is a brand new initiative that we worked with SPIN to develop in order to provide access to this mobility system to those who may not normally be able to participate. We as a city purchased 650 passes that provide 5 30-minute rides each day for 3 months. As I speak, several community organizations listed on the slide here are distributing these passes to their constituents who can use them to run errands, get to a job or an interview, or just enjoy some safe outdoor recreation. The passes go live this Thursday. SPIN Access is an existing program provided by SPIN that provides discounted rates to those who are already qualified under existing federal, state, or local assistance programs. SPIN also provides options such as pre-purchase fare cards for those without smartphone access. To date, we've had approximately 60 people enroll in SPIN Access, and that number is steadily growing. Our second vendor, Lime, has similar equity and affordability programs, and Lime is also working to partner with the disability advocates of Kent County to provide accessible vehicles to those who need them and qualify for them. All right, so my total budget for this project has been $400,000 coming out of Mobile GR's capital fund. As I stated previously, we have not spent any of this funding for vendor operations, maintenance, or subsidies. To date, we have spent approximately $33,500 on building parking zone infrastructure, including paint striping of zones and purchase and installation of signage materials. We have also used $81,000 to fund the SPIN Community Pass program. Future potential costs will include more infrastructure build out as we establish more parking zones, safety and education events, and future equity initiatives. So what's next? My staff is working on a 6-month interim evaluation of SPIN services to date. This evaluation will provide some formal feedback to SPIN, although we do talk to them just about every day or week and discuss the feedback and challenges in real time. SPIN is looking to add an electric assist bicycle to their fleet, and we hope to see those sometime later this summer. I mentioned that we've selected Lime as our second vendor. We're working with the city purchasing staff to develop an operating agreement, and I intend to bring that to commission for your approval in coming weeks, with the hope of having Lime's fleet launched in the next month or two. I intend to run SPIN and Lime alongside each other until this winter so we can compare their vehicles, operations, levels of service, and equity offerings. The long-term plan is by next spring, I hope to select a single long-term vendor who can provide shared micromobility services to our city and present that new contract for your approval sometime next spring. Concurrently, my team is also starting to develop an RFI to get industry input on public docking and charging stations. We hope to acquire and deploy a non-brand specific station that will work with our eventual long-term micromobility vendor, as well as provide charging services for privately owned electric micromobility vehicles. These stations may also provide us with an opportunity to earn advertising revenue under our newly approved transit advertising policy. So that concludes my brief. Thank you for the opportunity to update you on this pilot project. I hope you've all had an opportunity to get out and test ride some of these vehicles. And I can tell you that, you know, the scooters are fun, but the bikes that are coming are a whole different experience. I encourage you to get out on them when they show up on the street. So thank you again, and happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. All right, let me see if my colleagues have any questions. Commissioners, any questions or comments? We'll start with Commissioner Moody.
Yes, thank you so much for this report. I'm excited about the scooters. I know that from time to time within the third ward, I see a lot of people riding them when they're able to use them. I'm excited about how our city is transforming and in terms of transportation. But however, I heard your report in reference to some of the scooters being left in various places. Have you had any theft of the scooters?
So I don't have that exact number, Commissioner. I will tell you that since the start of the pilot, Spin has reported about 22 lost scooters. But that lost category can either mean they've been damaged beyond use, or they were just not able to track one down and the battery eventually died, which meant the GPS went out. But we have no specific reports of theft.
Yeah, I do plan to ride one very soon, as soon as the weather gets a little better. But I'm excited about them, and I appreciate the work that you guys have put into this, and looking forward to the bikes coming too. So it'll be more interesting. But thank you so much. I appreciate this report.
Thanks,
I will tell you, if you try and move a scooter without unlocking it, it's a pretty embarrassing experience. That thing starts squawking at you pretty loud, and everybody around you knows that you're not supposed to have it.
Well, I experienced that already. Somebody put one in front of our business, and I went out to try to move it. They're awfully heavy too, so I can see why it might be a difficult situation for somebody to try to take one. But yeah, once again, I'm excited about it, and I am glad that we're moving in this mode of transportation in the city. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Commissioner. And Commissioner, I'll go with you when you ride your scooter. I would love to see that.
Well, let's make it a scooter date, and we'll do it together.
All right, I'm in. Count me in. All right, I think I saw Commissioner Reppert's hand up and Commissioner Lanier's.
Yeah, I just want to say, first of all, I was a little skeptical about how this was going to roll out. This seems like it's gone exceptionally well, and I think that that's due to a lot of thoughtfulness on behalf of the mobility department, trying to work out things ahead of time. And but I know, that it's having an economic impact too. My college roommate brought the whole staff of his company up here, about 15 of them. They toured around town, then went out to eat in a social district. And so, people do love them and they use them. And I think that's great. But I also appreciate the intentionality around access, and was pleased to hear about some of those experiments that were done during the pilot. And hopefully we'll get more and more people riding them from all sorts of different backgrounds and all over the city. So good work to the team. This is I'm a little bit surprised at how great it's gone.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I have to say, I am delighted to hear that we haven't had any significant injuries. I know that was an issue in some other cities when they first rolled out, so that was good to hear as well. Let's see, Commissioner Lanier and then Commissioner Isasi.
Thank you. Thanks, Justin, for the presentation. A couple questions. Commissioner Moody, first of all, I want to share with you, I did ride one over the weekend. Dallas has footage. I'll see if he can send it to you.
Was your hair blowing in the wind?
Right, exactly. It was fun and it was comical at the same time. They are very powerful. Just have a couple questions, Justin. You mentioned the improper parking. So help me to understand that a little bit. So I think the messaging is that you can pick it up wherever you find one, and then are there designated locations where they're to be dropped off, or do you drop them off and they're supposed to be found based on the GPS as you were just kind of describing?
So in Grand Rapids specifically, we've established 176 of those designated parking zones, and that was an intentional effort to just try and get a little bit better control of the system and corral them in more consistent locations. So there's several benefits to that. One is it just keeps the city a little bit neater. But two, if you're looking to ride one, it makes them easier to find because you should be able to go to a zone.
So then the white tape that you're seeing where you would most likely find them, those are the parking zones. So you really are supposed to bring them back to those locations. I think that's probably an educational piece that I didn't register the scooter that I was riding. Dallas did, but there wasn't any indication of where to park them based on what we were able to garner. So I think it's probably just an educational piece. And if you're seeing it as a challenge, it's likely that we weren't the only ones who experienced that. I think the other question that I had was regarding the feedback for spin. It appeared as though you could only reserve one bike per app, which would mean then, you know, if people, going back to kind of some of what you're doing to mitigate those who may not have mobile devices, you know, it would limit who can participate, though they may be with someone who has the access to get to rent one. So I don't know if that's something that could be adjusted. I don't know why it's a restriction, but I'm just curious about that. And then finally, thanks for some of the data that you've shared with us. I'm curious to know if we're collecting any other demographical data on persons who are riding, you know, speaking, you know, to our equity goals that we have as a city, racial equity goals that we have as a city. It would be great to track who's riding them so that we can know if we are meeting goals of access across our entire city once we expand it beyond the pilot area.
So let me address the first question. So currently the technology requires you to have your own individual smartphone to sign out a scooter, or if you don't have a smartphone, you at least need an SMS-enabled phone. So you know, if you don't have a smartphone with the app, the scooters also have a number where you can send a text to activate an account that you've set up. The industry is progressing. There are some companies that are experimenting with prepaid cash cards, and you can use that card to swipe on the scooter like an RFID type technology, but that's still in development. With the demographics data, so we're trying to work with Spin and refining how we do that data. As you know, it's for them as a private company, they're trying to draw a fine line between what personal data they're collecting, and especially with the app having your credit card and then having the GPS tracker in the scooter. So some people are skeptical of the privacy aspect, but at least from a geographical perspective, we're trying to work with Spin to refine and get a little bit of it better about the common routes people are taking at their start and end points.
Yeah, and if I could add also, and perhaps Mr. Niramore, I had the same inquiry, Commissioner Lanier, about particularly for families and trying to access multiple scooters through one account. And so I'm hoping to see some industry improvements, enhancement that will allow that capability in the future. But that's all vendor enabled. So that's good feedback to take back. Anything else on that, Mr. Niramore? Okay.
Thank you, City Manager.
Thank you. All right, and Commissioner Isasi, did you have your hand up?
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks for the presentation. And yes, I remember when we had this in fiscal and we're like, okay, it's September and it gets cold here pretty quickly. So I'm happy to see that. I have yet to go on one. I need a little bit more confidence. So I'm interested in the bikes, but I do see people enjoying them at lots of different points. So I'm happy to see that. I want to say thank you to GR Mobile, to Mobile GR, for just taking all of the feedback that we've gotten from individuals. You know, I think they're certainly, as Commissioner Lanier said, just, you know, frustrations, I think, in explaining to people that it's a pilot. And so we're trying to gather this information. So I just want to say thank you to the department for your quick responses to neighbors who, you know, just maybe they hadn't gotten an update, maybe they weren't sure what was going on, and you know, looking for ways to improve that experience for people. I do have a question about, because I believe my notes when we talked about the pilot initially, I'm particularly interested in access to things like helmets as it relates to, especially when we're kind of expanding and looking at different groups of people where we might be providing passes, just like what is that additional safety accountability? We've had a few, unfortunately, fatal pedestrian and automobile accidents this year. And so while I'm glad to hear that we haven't had any of those safety concerns, I am interested in how helmets might play a part into that and how we might use existing infrastructure, because I do think that that's been mostly my fear is when I wanted to go on one, I told my husband, I don't have my bike helmet with me, so I'm reluctant to go on it. So that's my first question. And then my second question was really around, I know there were two aspects where you talked about, Justin, working with some of our community partners, which is wonderful. But then there was something else, spin community. So I'm wondering if that is, you mentioned for those who qualify for benefits. So are we working then with with our Kent County Department of Health and Human Services to be able to get this benefit out to individuals, and or trying to connect with them, because oftentimes they do have discretionary dollars at the county level, a variety of pools where this might be an option that they could do some purchasing of that as well. So those are my two questions. Thank you.
So let me address the helmets first, Commissioner Isasi. So we do encourage all riders to wear helmets, and that's done through both educational programs as well as being marked on the scooters. Unfortunately, that's not mandatory, but Spin does have a program. So if you go online to their website, there's a safety quiz you can take. If you ace it, I think you get a couple of dollars in ride credits, but you also get the option to get a free helmet. There's a little small shipping and handling fee, but Spin will send you a helmet for that shipping and handling fee. As we get, out of the realms of COVID and we get the second vendor on board and we start moving into warmer weather, we are looking at doing some public safety outreach events and bringing the vendors in person where they can have some demo rides and show us safe riding techniques, as well as hand out some safety equipment like helmets and other swag. So we're looking forward to some of those this summer. To address your second question about so we have not specifically partnered with the Kent County, but I'll make a note of that as maybe a potential future partnership. I just want to talk about, to get into the Spin Community Pass and the access. So Spin Access is Spin's ongoing program that's available for all of their customers who qualify. And the current discounted rate is 50% off both the unlock fee and the per minute fee. So if you qualify for any other type of government assistance program, you've got to do a little bit of paperwork there with Spin, but from there on out, you get those more affordable rates. Spin Community Pass is something that we worked with Spin to develop from the ground up. And that was really a city-funded and city-pushed event to provide this opportunity to people who may not normally be able to participate. One, to give them the opportunity to try it out. It's something nice. It's something innovative and something that not all people normally get to try. So we really wanted to share that across the board. And after that trial period, if they decide they like it, or if they decide it's a viable need of their daily transportation needs, then maybe that augments or replaces a bus pass or other transportation method that they're currently using.
I have one follow-up. Thank you, Justin. I have one follow-up question. As you started talking about that and that creation, are we connecting this at all to all the great work that's happening around Grow 1000? So I'm wondering, when I think about some of those students, Mayor, we talked a lot about like the transportation challenges, and we talked about first mile and last mile. So I'd be interested to know if we've connected these two investments. Thank you.
So not specifically, and really talking about Grow 1000 specifically, there's a little bit of conflict there with the age requirement, because some of our Grow 1000 participants are under 18, and the scooters, it's an industry standard where 18 is the age, and it's not so much a legal ordinance or anything that prevents, because we see kids all the time that buy like a Razor scooter or buy their own scooter that are allowed to ride it. It's really an industry standard, and that's primarily driven by the liability coverage that they have, that dictates that 18-year-old user requirement.
If I could add one just quick thing is, Commissioner Asasi, to your point also about pedestrian safety, we're also in the process right now of updating the driving change and heads up GR safety campaigns under the Vision Zero umbrella, because both of those were envisioned, and at that time, scooters were not really around when we did that. So we're working with the team and with Well Design, which is updating a lot of our communications materials, to update a lot of those so that later this summer you'll start seeing more materials that come out enforcing for the educational component of it. And we've also talked about, you know, partnering to be able to provide more helmets just for everybody in the community for using the bikes and for the scooters. So that's just something that our team continues to work on. So thank you for that question. And we've been really trying to work on improving safety, and there's going to be more to come in the next fiscal year.
Great, thank you. Commissioners, any other questions or comments related to this presentation? All right, well, I'll add my thanks to the entire team for helping make this pilot a success. And I think all of us are looking forward to this next phase. So thank you. All right, Commissioners, next that will take us to our final presentation. And then after this, I will call for a motion to go into executive session. This is a presentation on our Grand Rapids Housing Fund. So again, I think I'll turn this over to our city manager to get us started. And then I know that we have Mr. DeLong and Mr. Kilpatrick joining us today to walk us through this information. City manager?
Yep. Thank you, Mayor. And regarding the last presentation, my thanks to the Mobile GR Commission as well, who's partnered with Mobile GR and providing some feedback on the development program. So the next update is one that we have had ongoing briefings on, or the need to increase our housing supply and take our housing fund to the next level, both in terms of funding as well as governance. And so real pleased today that we can have this public update on some of the things that we're going to do to improve the fund governance as well as resourcing. As you know, we've had the fund established for some time, and our most recent use was using short-term rental assistance. Now we want to begin talking about what we can do to ensure more long-term housing sustainability and development. So with that, I'll turn it over to Deputy City Manager DeLong, who then will engage Mr. Kilpatrick.
Thank you, City Manager, and good morning, Commissioners and everyone who is on board today. So today we're going to do an overview of our recommendations for the Grand Rapids Housing Fund. And what we hope to do is advance our work in establishment of the fund. So Mr. Kilpatrick and I will go provide the update, and we'll talk about the status of our recommendations for creation of the fund as we get your feedback today. We've been working on this for some time. We've been on a journey of exploration, and today what we hope to do is help shape the recommendations that'll get it into final form. So it probably is important to, if Mr. Canfield can bring the presentation up. Go to the next slide. Thank you very much. So we've been on this journey together and been at this for some time. So you might recall that the use of a fund was first recommended by Great Housing Strategies back in 2015. That was carried forward in our work on Housing Now and brings it forward to today. We took some action, the city, as a city commission in 2018, where we approved a term sheet with the Grand Rapids Housing Commission for establishment of a management agreement and establishment of the fund in a 501c3. We made some progress, but that was interrupted by a couple of events. One was the decision by the Kent County Board of Commissioners to close the Kent County Land Bank Authority, which caused us to rethink our housing strategy. And I think maybe even more importantly, was the work that we were doing on establishment of our own city strategic plan and the need for better data about housing supply and what we should be doing. So the city strategic plan provided a framework for development of that work, and Housing Next was retained to formulate a direction for us and also to get market-based data. And what I'd like now for Ms. Kilpatrick to do is take us through the recommendations, and we'll go from there. So with that, Ryan, are you ready?
I'm ready. Thank you. And thank you for commissioners for the opportunity to share this proposed set of recommendations. Before we dive into the recommendations, I want to just provide a brief review of the housing data that we have as a result of the housing needs assessment. Just a reminder that the data we obtained through that effort highlighted that we have roughly half of our renters in the city of Grand Rapids are cost burdened, meaning they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And a little over 30% of renters are spending more than half of their income on housing. So those are significant housing needs in the system. And you'll also notice that the difference between the number of renters and homeowners who are cost burdened is significant. And then when we overlay that, the disaggregated data set, when we look at the homeownership rate by race and the number of the share of households among white families as compared to Black families, we have a much higher rate of homeownership, which leads us to understand that we have a much higher rate of cost burden among Black and brown families than we do among white families. So these are going to be important metrics for us to be reviewing as we think about how the housing fund should be set up and what the outcomes should be of that fund. Next slide, please. So secondarily, we know how many households we have who are cost overburdened. We also know how many households we're likely to have who want to move into the city over the next 5 years. And so you've seen this data before. We've got close to 9,000 new households that are looking to move into the city among both renters and homeowners. And being able to provide for this additional housing supply on top of solving for housing stability for those households that are already cost burdened, those are going to be two issues that we want to address very closely as part of this endeavor. Next slide. So what we're bringing to you today is a two-pronged policy recommendation. So the first prong of that is to recommend that the City Commission adopt a policy for the operation of the Grand Rapids Housing Fund. And what that policy would do is establish the purpose of the fund. It'll establish the board makeup and the appointment process for those board members, the duties and responsibilities of the board, the decision-making process, the proposed uses of the funds for investment in housing, and the initial deposits into the fund and future deposits going forward. Next slide. The second element of that is partnering with an accomplished fiduciary to steward the resources within the fund. So one of the things that we want to recognize here is this fund is set up to be a long-term strategic initiative. So the amount of funding that's in it today is intended to grow and hopefully grow significantly over time. And as that fund grows, what we want to be able to do is spend the earnings from the fund on housing, while we're simultaneously looking for other sources of funding, both from federal and state government, as well as from local partners. This fund is intended to operate similarly to an endowment. However, what we want to make sure of is that the fund board also has the ability to recommend spending beyond just the interest earned. So what this slide talks about is partnering with the Grand Rapids Community Foundation as the fiduciary steward of these dollars. They have a long track record of managing real estate investment portfolios and traditional investment portfolios with high rates of return relative to philanthropic investment. And they create an opportunity to accept financial contributions from outside sources, whether they're philanthropic, corporate, faith-based, or other members of the community. So it doesn't just have to be those public dollars coming from the city. This fund is also capable of accepting contributions from other partners in the community. Next slide. So the way we have this set up today, what we're recommending is an 11-member body that would be appointed in the following way. We're recommending 3 members are appointed, 1 from each ward by the city commissioners, 1 member appointed by the mayor, 1 by the city manager, 1 seat reserved for the executive director of the Grand Rapids Housing Commission to ensure that we have an even flow of information and as much alignment as possible between these 2 organizations. And then 5 members who are appointed from the community through the traditional committee on appointments process. And what we'd want to do with those additional 5 members is ensure that we have a broad range of experiences that are specific to housing, including finance and development, as well as health and well-being, lived experience, social work or philanthropy, and impact investing. We want to have a board that is ready and prepared to be good financial stewards of these funds, as well as who can decipher opportunities for significant impact in the community, Given the fact that we'll have relatively limited funds for the first several years, we want to be very strategic about what kinds of investments get made on the front end. And we want to be sure that these board members are fully aligned with not only the Housing Commission, but also our traditional city departments and our other local and regional housing partners. Next slide. So the fiduciary manager, also known as what we're recommending to be the Grand Rapids Community Foundation, they've offered to manage the housing fund as a non-endowed designated fund. And so essentially, the city would invest these dollars into the Grand Rapids Community Foundation, which would then be the steward. They would try to earn as much money as possible through portfolio management so that there was additional interest earned that could be spent within the community. And they would be the steward over the long term. Next slide. Then simultaneously, the Housing Fund Board, which is appointed by the City Commission, makes decisions about capital spending and distributions within the community. So the Grand Rapids Community Foundation figures out how to get those dollars to earn as much interest as possible. And the Housing Fund Board tries to figure out how to spend that interest earned in the community in the most equitable ways possible, with the largest impact on housing supply and stability. So those spending distribution decisions are designed to make housing more accessible to residents across the city. The Housing Fund Board is intended to be able to accept additional funds and funds from the city, as well as other sources for carrying out programming objectives. Also capable of entering into development agreements and grant agreements, whether with nonprofit or for-profit partners, provided that we're solving for our housing goals. They will review the investment of funds in furtherance of the program recommendations, support applications for supplemental grants and other funds for purposes of funding the approved programming, and also provide an annual investment plan to the City Commission with a written report and any recommendations for policy changes that might be impacting our ability to add more supply or stability in the marketplace. Next slide. So our proposed uses at this stage, in order to really maximize these dollars and get as much additional supply and housing stability as possible, are to really focus on property acquisition and preservation, as well as pre-development loan funds for qualified and experienced nonprofit housing providers. Also to focus on gap financing to support mixed use or mixed income developments among nonprofit and for-profit development partners, provided that they're including an affordable housing component. These funds could be used for income qualified homeowner assistance grants, loans to support necessary repairs or energy costs, as well as the addition of an accessory dwelling unit. And we may want to make some targeted investments in neighborhoods of focus. Also gap financing for development projects that are already receiving home or LIHTC dollars and need that last dollar investment in order to make the project maximally competitive. One of the other things that we heard both through the Great Housing Strategies and Housing Now was the need for some kind of funding mechanism to offset city fees that are required for new development of small scale affordable housing, whether it's water and sewer connections or development fees. And finally, finding other mechanisms to incentivize those small scale investments, in addition to supporting non-traditional developers of color, women-owned developers, first-time developers. We want to bring more people into this process of growing housing supply and wealth creation across the city. Next slide. So the proposed sources of funding. Currently, there are an initial roughly $900,000 available that we're making a recommendation to invest as the seed money. But we want to be clear that we have a goal of $20 million by 2025. So in the same amount of time that we know we've got to try to produce about 9,000 additional units, we want to really ramp up the investment in this fund over that period of time. So the current sources that have already been designated through the past efforts are the 2% of pilot payments. This was set up as the optional program where low-income housing tax credit developers have the opportunity to either invest 4% or 3% of pilot payments. If they choose that 3% option, then 2 of those 3% get invested into the housing fund. Also making a recommendation that unallocated sales proceeds from the sale of unrestricted public land be utilized as an investment in the housing fund, as well as targeting additional philanthropic contributions from the public, private, and institutional sector. Next slide. So I want to be clear about what our needs look like in the system today relative to the amount of funding that we have and our short-term 5-year goal of $20 million. When we look at our housing needs assessment in terms of the amount of housing we need just to get to a balanced market, as well as the number of households who are cost overburdened, we have a large capital and equity gap in the system. A little more than $1 billion is needed to be invested in rental housing, and about $250 million of that is likely going to be needed in gap financing. And then similarly among homeowner development, likely about $750 million are needed to be invested there, with about $100 million in gap financing. And then on top of that, additional rental assistance, close to $100 million would be needed to solve our problems as they are explicitly stated today via the housing needs assessment. So we've got a big goal in front of us. And so $20 million is our first start. That's our down payment. That's where we want to get to. We want to be looking for additional state and federal funds, as well as all kinds of ways to be partnering with local for-profit and nonprofit partners and investors to get to the amount of housing supply and housing stability that we need to have a really balanced, dynamic marketplace. But want to be clear about where we are and where we're headed. Next slide, please. So given those disparities between the amount of funding available today and the amount of funding that we really need going forward, the Housing Fund Board is going to have to be prepared to work to serve the greatest number of households with housing needs, while also acknowledging that current funding resources can't solve for every community need today. And so we've got to be very clear about what are our priorities. And we've got to find those partnerships with other organizations within the community to leverage and maximize dollars wherever we can. Next slide. So what we're recommending here is creating a non-endowed designated fund through the Grand Rapids Community Foundation, using an agreement that would establish a relationship with a reliable and proven partner for financial management and stewardship of those assets, and for the purpose of supporting the greatest number of residents through development of the greatest amount of housing. We know that the Grand Rapids Community Foundation is capable of managing the investment of principal and interest for maximum return, and we're suggesting the Grand Rapids Housing Fund Board will make all of the housing spending and disbursement decisions within the community, and that this creates an opportunity to accept financial contributions from outside sources. Next slide. So here I'm going to pass it back to Deputy City Manager Eric DeLong to wrap up.
Thank you, Mr. Kirkpatrick. And so next steps that we would propose for your consideration are first consideration of a policy governing the Grand Rapids Housing Fund Board. Second, consideration of approval of the agreement with the city for the fund with the Grand Rapids Community Foundation. And then the third, will bring to you any work that we need to do to wind down our past initiatives with the Grand Rapids Housing Fund. We hope to bring these forward to you over the next several months. So with that, our presentation is concluded, and we can talk about questions or concerns you may have. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Ryan. Appreciate this update. I do feel that this captures a lot of the feedback that this body has provided over the last year. And I personally want to say thank you to Mr. Kilpatrick for all of your work and helping us navigate what we can do to ensure access to safe and affordable housing throughout our city. So thank you for that. I will open it up for questions. I'll start with Commissioner Jones.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to Mr. Kilpatrick and Mr. DeLong for the presentation. I'm very pleased with what the planned direction is. I think it makes a significant amount of sense. I know that there have been many within the community who are asking what next concerning the housing fund. I think that this is a very well thought out process, and I would just like to see us get rather aggressive in an effort to try to raise as many dollars as possible to serve as a gap, and just continue down the path of trying to get creative in an effort to develop more housing with, of course, a laser beam focus, not just obviously on rental units, but on ownership opportunities, single family ownership opportunities. It seems to be that more and more developers are going down the route of creating more of a townhouse or townhome structure. And simply because of, the ability to, build more units per se compared to a traditional home with a yard, which I think is probably the more difficult task, with the reality being that we just lack land, we lack real estate. And so I'm very, very hopeful and would love to see us, again, be very aggressive with the timeline and get this in place as soon as possible so that we can begin the process of again, raising as much money as possible and working with developers to come up with ideas to create more housing. So thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. I know many of us have made it really clear that home ownership is a priority. We know that that's directly connected to building wealth in our community. And so I appreciate that this fund would enable us to do some real impactful work related to that. So thank you. Commissioner Ruppert? Commissioner, did you have a question? Commissioner Ruppert? Is your hand up? Yes.
Yeah, sorry, my computer froze. A hot second. Thank you, Eric and Ryan, for this presentation. I've been thinking about this kind of nonstop for a couple of years, and I really appreciate the data at the beginning and the end. We do have a supply issue, but the supply has to be targeted. And so I'm so grateful for the data that we have, both broken down by race and ethnicity and also geography, but also, keeping those statistics front of mind around families who are overburdened from costs from housing. And then I also appreciate the stats at the end about how, $20 million is our down payment. We need $500 million, if my quick math is correct, to solve the issue. And so I just appreciate those two being held up. And just like the mobility pilot, I'm just grateful for the incredible thoughtfulness on the front end. The genesis of something like this, we only have an opportunity to establish and create something like this once in a while. And so I think that the appointment process, I think that working with the community foundation, and then some of the initial ideas of what we want to stimulate with this money are all very thoughtful and right in line with, like the mayor said, what we've been hearing from people. So thanks for your work. Thanks for your leadership. I'm excited to be talking about it for the next couple of months.
Thanks, Commissioner. Commissioner Moody, you have your hand up. Go ahead, Commissioner Moody.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you for the report. I just have this concern with the data that we constantly get around home ownership, and it seems like every time we get data, the data of home ownership is constantly low among African American community. And I'm wondering that with this board, are we going to tackle the issues of ownership and then look at the fact as to where the problems really lie in terms of people being able to afford a home, and with banks assisting and helping out? And where would the Grand Rapids Foundation be at in terms of making those things occur?
Yeah, I think that the intent here is to work really closely with the Housing Fund board members to think through our spending opportunities within both neighborhoods of focus and targeting households of color, while also making sure that we're satisfying all of the fair housing laws that we're going to be subjected to. So what we want to be clear about is that our outcomes need to demonstrate equitable access to homeownership and equitable outcomes as it relates to homeownership, and that our spending decisions need to track against those outcomes. And so I think that we'll probably be, once the fund board is created and appointed, we'll want to have some really honest conversations with that board. And my hope is that we'll be bringing in some of our major lenders in the community who have CRA obligations or who already have strong community ties, to be talking through the barriers to homeownership, both from a cost side relative to local wages, as well as those financing requirements that relate to down payment or that relate to credit history. So solving for all of those things is going to be critical in order to solve for homeownership.
Yeah, I thank you. I understand that, Ryan, but my biggest concern again is these numbers. So let me put it this way. This board will have the opportunity to put something in place or to discuss or talk about how we are to change some of the biases that take place within communities and how we are to look at certain financial organizations that do lend money to homeowners to buy homes. Like, I want to really deal with the racism that we're dealing with when it comes to home ownership, because it is still out there. Redlining is still out there, and credit problems are still out there. And there are certain factors that take place, even if you have some good credit that seems to find a way not to be able to give you the loans. Like Commissioner Jones said, I'm concerned about home ownership, not modules. I'm concerned about houses being built for families. We have enough apartments, which is great. But when it comes to home ownership within the African American community, these numbers always seem to be low, and that's what my biggest concern is. Thank you, though, Ryan. I appreciate your report.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Commissioner, thank you. I would just add that this is one tool that we'll deploy to address that concern. And there are many, it's also an economic development issue as well that we'll deal with through our economic development strategies. So, but know that that's going to be on the mind of the Affordable Housing Board.
Thanks, Eric. Commissioner Isasi?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation, Ryan. I just have a couple of questions. My first one is about some of the seats. Mayor, we had kind of talked about the Planning Commission and obviously looking at the need for more housing in our city. So will somebody from Planning Commission be considered for this, or will we make that, have that more specific as be part of the board in terms of just making sure that all of our bodies are sort of speaking to one another? So that's one of my questions. The second is on, making decisions. I think we all go into this with the best intentions, and we have to also understand that conflict is going to happen when we're dealing with significant amounts of money, when we're dealing with investments, when we're dealing with systemic racism. So I'd love to understand, again, I don't expect it to be done today. There's a lot of stuff you're asking us, but sort of for the future to inform, how do we handle that conflict or deal with that conflict in the most productive ways and recognize that as part of a process when we have significant investment. The third is really around, just again, as we look at that body, I wasn't here for this last go round. I was in the cheap seats watching you all do this work. And, Commissioner Kelly, I think, gave me a pretty big book about here are all the things to consider. But, there's been so much work on behalf of the city manager and city staff, like on our strategic plan, our investments in equity. So we talked about the emphasis in the areas, which I think is pretty broad. And I would say the running theme should be making sure that those individuals either are coming in with that baseline understanding of equity and how that plays out in all of our city services and how we have identified that in our strategic plan. So I hope that would be part of that onboarding process, is making sure that, sort of the language and the tools that we use in our strategic plan are understood by that body so it can be most successful. And then, we didn't talk, we talked a little bit about it today in fiscal, but obviously how this is all playing out as it relates to, and looking for a variety of sources, but specifically about the American Recovery Act dollars that will be coming into our community. So just, I know we've had some of those discussions, but they've been at much higher levels. So those are my questions, and thanks again for the presentation.
Yeah. Thanks, Commissioner. I'll add to that. I think your point about what is our plan for training and onboarding is a really good one. And we should be thinking about that, not just for this body, but for all of our boards and commissions. And I know we've started to do that over this past year. And then I think that your point about who serves on the board, I know in looking at next steps, when we look at the adoption of our policy and the governing, we can have some more detailed conversations about that. And then I'll let Ryan and Eric speak to whether they had any conversations about the value of having a planning commissioner on there. I do wonder if that potentially could create a conflict, but I'll defer to them about that point. And your last point, I know city manager has also talked about kind of our plan once we know the exact amount of the federal dollars as well as the guidelines. Those have not been finalized yet. Once they are at the federal level, we'll be able to have some additional conversations, but potentially that could be a pot of funds that we could use to increase this fund pretty quickly.
Yep, Mayor,
Thank you, Mayor.
Mayor, we specifically wanted to get feedback from you today before being too prescriptive of the actual particulars of the governance process regarding the Planning Commission appointment. We never thought to make that an ex officio seat on the board, but it's certainly something we can go back and discuss, but that was not the intent. There was, by various appointments, someone can have experience with residential development or development in general, but it was never intended to be a ex officio position from the Planning Commission. Regarding the I do think in terms of the board dynamics, like all the other boards, we probably could use this as an opportunity to come up with a better onboarding model for all of our other boards to make sure that everyone is familiar with not only the role of the board, but the broader context in which our boards operate regarding charter, the strategic plan, and some of the values of the city. And so this will be a good pilot for revamping that experience. And then lastly, on the budget process, we are, as to the mayor's right, there's a lot of uncertainty regarding the use of the funds, but one of the things we aspirationally would like to do once we prioritize some of the budget gaps that we have is to see what things can be done to create sustainable assets, and certainly housing is one of them. So the housing fund is certainly a potential spot. Mr. DeLong, did you have anything else to add?
You covered that well, Mark. The decision-making process is something that I would amplify. And so the Housing Fund Board will be making the investment decisions, and those decisions will come back to you as recommendations to enter into any agreements or distributions that would be required. So City Commission will have a role in monitoring how decisions are made, both those prospectively and also when the actual agreements are being entered into. So I think there'll be lots of opportunity to interact between the Housing Fund Board and the City Commission.
And essentially, the model changes. Before, the City Commission had deferred its governance to the Housing Commission, and City Commission was just advisory or appointing a board of advisors that would advise the Housing Commission. And so now with this model, you have more direct governance over strategy, not investments. And the beauty of using the community foundation is that they are able to get higher returns on the pool of assets in our general yield from the city's treasury. So I do think that, we want to make sure that we have control now. We don't want to over, manage the board, but there still should be some accountability that ties in to our longer term strategic goals of housing development and affordability.
Thank you, City Manager. And I'll just say, I know some of us were part of these early conversations when we thought about kind of forming this under the Housing Commission. I personally like this plan a whole lot better. I think it creates much more independence. I think initially I remember being a part of those early conversations. I think initially we thought that the Housing Commission could help raise funds, or even we could use our funds to leverage some of the dollars that they had access to. I think having the Housing Commission appointee around the board is sufficient to kind of think creatively about potentially how to do that. But I think this model creates a much more independent body, and as the city manager says, opens us up to the possibility of greater investments. So, Commissioner Lanier?
Thanks, Mayor. Thank you so much to Ryan and Eric for the presentation. I have a couple questions, and I'll start with the topic of the Housing Commission and the existing agreement that we have with them. And as the history of this presentation shared, it was, I think, 2019. So I am curious to know, and I guess maybe it's safe to assume that the Housing Commission is okay with getting out of that agreement, and that, you know, what we're considering now wouldn't necessarily pose a challenge with us ending what we had started with them and starting something new. I want to compliment the comment that Commissioner Isasi made about the Planning Commission. And I think, Mayor, to the point that you were making, we're not necessarily sure if there would be a conflict, but I do see the value in having a person, you know, so maybe out of those 5 remaining appointed seats, potentially maybe one of those could be switched to the planning commissioner, because I do know that we frequently see kind of this conflict, and it hasn't happened in a while, but where things will trickle down, and by the time it gets to us, we're like, there's a disconnect in kind of what our priorities are versus, you know, what the Planning Commission is recommending. And I think to have them at the table at earlier conversations about priorities and strategies probably would be helpful. I don't know if I'm fully understanding the non-endowed designated fund and what that entails. The Community Foundation is amazing at getting returns on the dollars that they are managing. And so I don't know if this reduces that, but certainly I think we need to get as higher rate of return as possible, recognizing that we have $1 billion goal. And so if someone could kind of explain that to me, and I don't know if there's a quick response, or city manager, if that's something maybe we can offline, or deputy city manager offline, we can talk about in more detail. I'm just not fully understanding that. And it's a new term for me. So if no one else has that question, I guess we could talk about that later. And then on slide 11, there was the point about how much we would retrieve from the pilots. And we're looking at, I think, 2% right now for those, the revenue that would be generated from pilot projects. So I'm curious to know, I know, again, I often talk about policy making as crockpot work, because it takes a long time to get to the place where the policies are coming to fruition. And so this was a discussion from many years ago. So I'm curious to know if 2% is what we were thinking back then, or if we had a higher percentage and this is a reduction. So if someone could answer that for me, that would be good. And then I would not, and Ryan, if you're still on, I know every time you're with us, I am mentioning that our housing needs and concerns are regional. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about that again today, because I think the city of Grand Rapids is shouldering, I think, too much of the housing demand. And I think and I know that there have been more conversations surrounding this, but I would like us to get a little bit more aggressive with those conversations and integrate some of what's happening with those conversations every time we receive an update, so that we can see that we're truly making sure that other municipalities and even the county are aware of the housing needs and are trying to address them as well, so that we can make greater impact faster. Certainly that doesn't necessarily impact this fund, but I just think as we're having a housing discussion, I think that that's important to kind of hear progress on that as well. And I think the last question was really about timeline. You know, I heard, you know, comments about soon and things of that nature. It would be great if we know some dates or seasons or years that we're considering some of these steps. That would kind of help me to know like when to follow up on questions about, progress, if we were a little bit clearer on some of those dates. So that concludes my few questions.
Let me
Good questions, Commissioner. Go ahead, Stephen.
Just small questions, Mayor. If I could, I'm gonna take a stab at the governing bodies and then ask Eric and Ryan to follow up on the rest. Regarding the Housing Commission, I had discussion both with the former executive director as well as the current executive director around our need initially to pause. I think it was the agreement was 2018, we paused in 2019 because we were trying to really determine what problem we were trying to solve, and it wasn't just low income housing, it was housing affordability at all levels. And so I've talked to the current executive director yesterday and requested that we be on the next agenda for the Housing Commission to follow up and give them an update based on discussion today. And prior to that, I think the investment of the Housing Commission was around $50,000 or so in legal fees, and we agreed we'd be happy to reimburse the cost of that. But I think if we can continue to show progress, there may not be a need to do that from the Housing Commission. But we're open to do whatever is needed to make sure that we have a good partnership moving forward. We want this to be complementary and collaborative to their work. The second, on the Planning Commission, we really should talk to the city attorney about that, because I can see if they're involved in development and as a developer or a board that focuses on development, that would conflict them out of being neutral in reviewing any proposal that comes as a result of this from their work as a planning commissioner. So I would like to ask the city attorney's office to help us look at the feasibility of that between now and the time we bring forth any further recommendations on this. And then lastly, the time. I mean, if it were up to Mr. Eric DeLong, you would be voting on this today. That is why we's ready to move that fast, but we wanted to have this discussion first. And then there's several things we can bring back in more detail. One is the actual, if you will, governing document charter that lays out what the board would be like, and then the subsequent agreement with the community foundation. And then there's the budgetary discussion of any potential uses of any federal money that we might get to seed the fund. That's going to happen in the budget process. So we can come back with more detailed update, but within the next couple of months, within the next month, definitely on the fiscal side, but also we could have some concurring conversations during the budget process around the fund's governance as well. So regarding the 2% pilot and the regional housing needs and the other issue on now not non-endowed funds, I'll turn over to Mr. DeLong and Mr. Kilpatrick.
Thank you, City Manager. So I'll take the non-endowed and also the pilot question, and then Ryan can take the regional needs question. So the difference between an endowed fund and a non-endowed fund is really how much you can spend in any one year. So an endowed fund has to, they're both designated for a specific purpose. So in the case of an endowed fund, you're only able to spend the earnings of the fund because you're maintaining the full corpus of the fund. In a non-endowed fund, it provides the flexibility for a period of time to accelerate spending investment, to make more difference in the area where you want to make impact investments. So we chose the non-endowed designated fund as a way to give us the flexibility, the board and the commission of flexibility to make more impact faster rather than waiting for earnings to grow as the corpus grows. So that might seem a little contrarian because we'll be spending some of our the money we put in faster, so we'll have actually a little lower interest earnings. But over the long term, it's better, I think, to accelerate than it is to wait. So that's why we picked that approach. And then on the pilot question, so we adopted this policy, and I don't know the exact year, but it's been in effect for, I think, at least 3 years, maybe 2018. It was part of the Housing Now recommendations. And so developers have been selecting that option. LIHTC developers have been accepting that or selecting that option since that time. And some of those projects are now in the pipeline. You know, they've been approved by MISTA, they've received their LIHTC, and they may actually be beginning to be ready to begin making their payments. So the number hasn't changed. It's the same number that we had initially. And remember, the existing policy at the time was 4% was paid to the city as a pilot, and we received it as revenue. And so what we wanted to do was incent the developers to LIHTC housing developers to help support other affordable housing. So we said, if you make a 1% pilot payment and a 2% other payment, then we'll accept that rather than the 4% pilot. And they're all very economic, and they've all accepted the 3% option. So to your point, the number has not changed. It's the same number we've always talked about. And then Ryan could, I think, address regional housing needs better than anyone on the call. So
I don't know about that, but Commissioner Lanier, you know that I completely agree with you on the regional nature of housing demand. And we've gotten some funding from other community partners to better communicate the housing needs assessment on a countywide basis. And so we're doing that now, both through media outlets as well as through additional communication materials to make sure that we have as much awareness of the housing needs across Kent County. And then obviously we're also doing work in Ottawa County, which influences housing supply across the region. But then we've also been doing work to get in front of local planning commissioners, township officials, and other city officials to make sure that we're putting out potential best practices without being overly prescriptive. So what we're trying to do is offer up a large suite of options alongside the housing needs assessment, so that local officials across the county and across the region have both an understanding of the need as well as the opportunities that they have in front of them to begin to try to work to solve for that need. And so my hope is that we have many more communities who begin to row in the same direction and pull a little bit of weight as it relates to adding more housing supply at all price points within their local marketplace.
Thank you. Thank you all for your responses.
Yeah, thanks. Commissioners, any other questions or comments? Commissioner O'Connor?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. It's just when we started this conversation about Affordable Housing Fund years ago, when you had me chair the committee on affordable housing stuff, and so it's great to see this finally come to life. I think just a couple of quick points on there. One of the just talking about the pilot, that was a mechanism that we created to as a strategy to help fund this, and obviously that is one of the, outside of the assets from disposed properties, that's one of the only functions the city has to contribute to this fund. So I think it's just, as the conversation continues to evolve, it's important that we continue to think about other strategies at which the city can create revenue streams to contribute to this, working with philanthropic communities and public and private donors is going to be important. But I think, just creating, it's a lot of little revenue streams, I think, are going to be the keys to success. It's not just, we're not going to have big swings very often where we're going to put big chunks of money in here, but creating longer term solutions that have just, lots and lots of little funding streams. And so just, I don't think I have a strategy today, but I think I have some ideas that I hope we can continue to, work on that as an evolution of what we do next. And then the kind of coupled with that is, as Mr. Kilpatrick mentioned, there's a lot of ways in which those dollars could be spent to create additional units and also lower the cost of development for those things. And like one of those, one example that comes right to mind is looking at water and sewer connections for accessory dwelling units. And while we could spend money money to fix that problem. I think there's underlying city policy that could come into play, that we could just remove that barrier by creating a pathway to not require multiple water connections and multiple sewer connections when someone adds an ADU, because that adds $10,000 to $15,000 to a project. So we can just eliminate that barrier rather than having to spend money from this fund to fix that or to overcome that. I think there's underlying city policy discussion that we need to work on to just eliminate some of those barriers to creating these additional units with lower costs. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Commissioner. That's an excellent point, and I've heard that feedback as well. And as we've talked about, when it comes to housing, we really need a multi-pronged approach, and the housing fund is one piece of the puzzle, but we know it's not the only piece. And I agree with you. We need to be looking at any policy decisions we can make here at the city to reduce the cost of adding housing in the city as well. So thank you for that. Commissioners, any final questions or thoughts? I believe we have a good list of next steps. So if you have additional feedback after today, please get that to our city manager and Mr. DeLong, and we'll move forward on hopefully establishing this fund, getting it off the ground, getting the governance structure in place, and identifying additional resources to add to try to get it to that higher number. I know Ryan Kilpatrick talks about 20 million. I'd love to see it higher than that as quickly as possible, far before 2025. And that will be conversations we can have in the future. So with that, we'll end this briefing. And I will now ask for a motion to go into executive session. We are all sent a separate link from our attorney's office for that. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Support.
All right, again, supported. And I'll turn to our city clerk to call the vote on that.
Commissioner Isasi?
Yes.
Commissioner Repart?
Yes.
Commissioner Lanier?
Aye.
Commissioner Jones?
Yes, sir.
Commissioner O'Connor?
Yes.
Commissioner Moody?
Yes.
Mayor Bliss?
Yes, and let me clarify, Commissioners, this executive session is to hear a legal opinion. So I know I said that earlier in the meeting, but let me say it again since we just voted. So we'll close out of Committee of the Whole and let's take a 2-minute break and then call into executive session. Thanks, everyone.